your teacher, Kathy Brasby, and together we will be taking a look at Daniel chapters 1 through 7, how to live faithfully in a troubled time. Thanks for joining me, and I am looking forward to this study because it is so appropriate for today. We are living in difficult times. Some of us may have asked, where's God in these times? Can he overcome what looks like overwhelming opposition, even in our neighborhoods, in our country? Um, what is God doing in this time? We're going to start to take a look at some of these questions as we go through the book of Daniel. Daniel lived in a time we would call it Old Testament times, but roughly 587 to 539 BC, roughly. He lived during the time of the exile. What this meant was this was the time when the nation of Judah was captured by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and many of the people who lived in Jerusalem and Judah were deported into that land of Babylon. The temple in Jerusalem, and really most of Jerusalem, was destroyed. Most of the people in Judah were taken to Babylon. And this followed the idolatry of a series of kings of Judah. Over and over and over, they found their strength, they thought, and their support in other gods and abandoned the one God, Yahweh. So we meet now in Daniel, we will meet Nebuchadnezzar. And I want to talk really briefly about Babylon. Because at that time, Babylon was a powerful and vast empire. Great wealth, very broad, had continued to capture many, many lands. One of the interesting things, just to give you a little glimpse of the wonder of Babylon, is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. That is considered one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. And scholars actually, to be honest, differ on whether it was just a fable or if it actually existed. But there are descriptions of it in ancient writings that show us a very exotic and magnificent place. To a young Jewish boy as a captive in a strange land, that gardens, the city, the armies, the culture, everything in Babylon must have looked spectacular and actually very successful. He could have been tempted to think this might be the better way. They are more powerful than we are. They have figured out life better than we can. Would he embrace this rich culture, or would he hang on to his God, who honestly didn't even seem to have protected him? Those are huge questions. And I think questions that we can kind of relate to today, because we see a culture that is powerful and seems like they're just everywhere, squashing our faith walk. How can we survive in that? One thing we will learn as we go through these chapters in Daniel is Daniel teaches us that our struggle is not to make our culture Christian, but our question is, how can a Christian live in a hostile culture? So let's dive into Daniel. If you have a Bible, feel free to follow along. I will read the text as we go along. But yeah, feel free to read along if you'd like to. So we'll look at Daniel 1 through 2 to start with. During the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. So here we first meet Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. We know historically that 605 BC, Jehoiakim was forced to be an unwilling vassal. And then a few years later, Nebuchadnezzar had many people from Judah deported back to Babylon. So this is the time frame we're in. I want you to notice that the Lord gave him, that'd be Nebuchadnezzar, victory over King Jehoiakim, and the Lord permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. That seems odd to us, but the key here is gave. And the key is that term, the Lord, in Hebrew is Adonai, which emphasizes God's ownership, his control, his kingship. So even though King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, I'm sure, felt like it was their army that gave them victory over Judah, and their army took these sacred objects, no, we're told was God allowing it. We'll have to just bear with the story to figure out why or how he used it, but we see that immediately with it. The Lord gave him victory. An interesting thing here is these temple objects were taken out of the temple of God and taken to the temple of the Babylonian gods. This was actually a very big deal in those ancient cultures. It was a common practice in that Near East for a victorious army to plunder the temple of the defeated nation and then to take those symbols of the defeated temple and the defeated god back to place before their own god to illustrate which god was more powerful. People in those days were very religious. They all had gods. And there was just constantly this push and pull between territorial gods and which one was more powerful. And so if an army defeated a nation, they would show that their God is better than your God, and by just taking those objects. Now, we're not going to study this, but you might find it interesting. If you go back to 1 Samuel chapters 4 and 5, there's a story there about the Philistines defeating the Israelites in battle, and they took the Ark of the Covenant. That would also be a treasure from the, in this case, the tabernacle of God, of Yahweh, and they took it to the temple of Dagon, which was the Philistine god. And that was to illustrate that the Philistine god, Dagon, had soundly whipped Yahweh. But if you will go read what happened next, it's actually a little bit of a humorous story. And you'll see that eventually the Philistines sent the Ark of the Covenant back. Illustrating in some way that Dagon had not defeated Yahweh. Interesting story. And that's kind of what's going on here. But here we see the Lord gave Nebuchadnezzar victory. Let him take some of these sacred objects. Again, we see God is in control. We don't always understand. We don't understand at this point why he allowed it, but we are told he did. He is in control. And really, one of the major themes in the book, and I'll come back to it again, is to reinforce the idea, the understanding that the sovereignty of God far surpasses the power of even the most mighty of human rulers. And certainly Nebuchadnezzar fit in that category of most mighty of human rulers. But let's move on in our text, verses 3 and 4. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar is trying to control Judah without occupying it with soldiers. He had a puppet king on the throne in Judah. Now he is taking taking members of the royal family, noble families, the best of the best is what we would say. And he has brought them back to Babylon to teach them language, culture, the wisdom of the Babylonians, assimilating them into Babylonian culture. And so they would be very able to serve in political ways. They'd be very able to communicate back to their own people about the presence of the Babylonians and how that they could be trusted. So there was an attempt here to prevent any kind of an uprising. So Daniel and friends, who we will meet in just a minute, were nobles, maybe descendants of King Hezekiah. We don't know that for sure, but they were certainly of a noble family, possibly of the royal family. Probably under age 20, they were already intelligent, well-informed, well-educated young men. And they were handsome without any physical defect. This would look better. You know how our politicians today, the good-looking ones present themselves better. And so again, if they're going to be the face of Babylon back to their own people, they want very attractive, intelligent, well-educated people to speak the language and to communicate. So these young men would be immersed in the culture of Babylon, their language, literature, arts, many ways. So look at verse 5. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. So these young trainees were to be given the best of everything, the best of the best, including food from the king's own table. I suspect Nebuchadnezzar assumed this would help secure their allegiance to him. They get the best clothes, the best accommodations, the best servants, the best attendees, the best food, probably better than what they left behind in Jerusalem. This could look very good to these young men. But let's continue. So verse 6 and 7, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. Azariah was called Abednego. Familiar names. You probably have heard their names before. The idea of changing a name indicated some authority over that person. Not just anybody could change your name, but only someone who had authority. So immediately, the Babylonians are establishing some authority. Now, what they also did now was they changed the names to contain the name of a Babylonian deity, again, to connect them to the Babylonian religion and culture. And so that name of the deity is now connected with the person's identity. So they're re-educating these young men, giving them a new name. This is all about changing their mind to assimilate them into a new culture. So Daniel is named Belteshazzar, and that means may a god protect his life. That first part of his name, Bel, is probably one of the high gods in the Babylonian religion, and it probably is one of the favorite gods of Nebuchadnezzar. So actually, from the Babylonian point of view, Daniel is being given a high and special name. Azariah is renamed Abednego, which means servant of Nabu, another god. Hananiah is renamed Shadrach, and we're not real sure what that one is. But Mishael is renamed Meshach, and Meshach could easily be a form of the name Marduk, which was also one of Nebuchadnezzar's favorite gods. So we see here excuse me, the Babylonians try to give new identity and allegiance through a new name. This is all pretty tempting to these young men. They're coming into a place, why not just fit in? Everything looks pretty good. Good food, good, like I said, good clothing, good. I'm sure that they had luxurious accommodations, plenty of attendants. They would be given honor and some authority in this new kingdom. Why not give in? It just looked like the easy way. The fulfilling way is what it looked like. But we go to verse 8. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now, God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. We're going to stop there. At this point, we have no recorded resistance to any of this from Daniel. He has a new name. They have a new educational curriculum, a new location. We haven't seen any resistance to any of this, and now resistance comes against a diet? Why? People have suggested that Daniel was determined to remain kosher, and the idea of not defiling himself meant he was going to stay kosher to the Jewish foods. But if so, why did he refrain from wine, which was acceptable to the Jews? Some have suggested that the food that was offered to these young men was offered to the gods before it was being served. If that's the case, why would he eat anything they offered him? Because probably any food that came to them went through that same process. Perhaps Daniel thought, well, this is my point of rebellion. I am not going to eat the food offered by the king as just a political protest. Well, if that's the case, again, why eat the vegetables? Of course, why accept the new name? Why accept the accommodations? So those may not be the most satisfactory of reasons why Daniel didn't want to eat this food and wine given to them by the king. But some things to consider here. The food coming from the Babylonians would likely allow these young men to continue to be good-looking, healthy, vigorous, and strong. So, did they believe that their physical appearance and maybe even their intellectual gifts were a gift of the Babylonian culture? By rejecting the Babylonian foods, they knew that was not the case. Interesting to notice also that this diet that we're about to see is private. Only the 4 and the chief officials knew of it. So let's move ahead into Daniel 1, 10 through 14. But he, and this would be the chief of staff, he responded, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youth your age, I am afraid the king will have me beheaded. Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please, test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. And the attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. So, Daniel is setting up a test, and he makes it clear. Test us, compare us that are not eating the king's special foods with the young men who are eating the king's special foods, and then make your decision. Compare our appearance at that time. Is it the Babylonians' food that is making us all healthy, or is it something or someone else? Well, let's continue on. Daniel 15 and 16. Daniel 1, 15 and 16. At the end of 10 days, at the end of this test, at the end of 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young man who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, The attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and water provided to the others. The test works. Daniel has scored a point, at least for himself and his three friends and their attendant, because they're really the only ones who knew. So we learn, as we read this little story, it is not Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian regime that make the young men prosper. It is not the Babylonians that make them prosper. It is God. Remember what the chief of staff said, I'm afraid of my king, my Lord the king, and he should have been afraid of Daniel's Lord and King, Yahweh or God. So let's continue. Daniel 1:17, God gave these four men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret meanings of visions and dreams. So for the third time in the chapter, God gave something to someone. We saw back in verse 2, God gave Jehoiakim and Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 9, God gave the chief official sympathy toward Daniel and his friends. And now we see in verse 17 that God gave the four young men knowledge and understanding. We see God giving. It reminds us God has not disappeared from the life of these young men and his people. God has not disappeared just because they're in Babylon. But let's continue. Verse 18. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them. No one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Now, the Babylonians would take credit for these four young men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But Daniel and his friends knew where the credit was due. They grew physically robust, not because of their Babylonian diet, but because of the grace of God. No one impressed Nebuchadnezzar as much as these four young men. And notice that the author of Daniel uses their Hebrew names here to emphasize the point of who they belong to. The overall theme of God's giving in chapter 1 shows who's really in control of the events of Daniel's life and of the people of God in general. Now, did they get to go home? Did they get to have all their belongings returned to them and their former status in place again? No. They were far from home in a difficult culture and place. But we see God is actively working in their lives, just as we look at chapter 1. We see here in this verse, one more thing I want to tell you. In this verse, we see a comparison. This first time we meet the magicians and enchanters of the Babylonian courts. And we find out that these four young men are 10 times more capable. Why? We know that these magicians, enchanters, received their wisdom from gods, whom the Israelites recognized as non-existent, or even worse, from the dark side. God gives Daniel special ability to interpret visions and dreams. And we will meet these magicians and enchanters in the coming chapters. And we will continue to see comparisons between them and how they get their wisdom, and between Daniel and his friends. One point that I want to just have you consider as we move forward is how much Daniel is similar to Joseph in the book of Genesis. Briefly, both are in a foreign court. Both are blessed by God to stand out as wise and responsible men. Both could interpret visions and dreams as given by God. And both would triumph over pagan or false wisdom with the wisdom of God. So we see here, both in Daniel and Joseph, another theme I just briefly mentioned, it will come up again. But in Jewish monotheism, in other words, Jews believed in one God, their beliefs were and are that the wisdom of the whole world belongs to the one God. Other nations were very territorial with their gods. They believed a god was a Babylonian god, a different god was an Egyptian god, a different god was a Moabite god. But the Jewish people believed the whole world belongs to one God. And therefore, and we see it in the life of Joseph, we see it in the life of Daniel, and other places as well. Therefore, one who serves God can work well in the wider world. Hard work and native ability allows them to rise to prominent place. So they can be in challenging places and still achieve an excellence. And that's a good word to us, because we may feel we are in a hostile culture, but we can work with hard work, with responsibility, and with God's wisdom, and we may on occasion rise to prominent place. So let's close out the chapter. Verse 21, we're just reminded that Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. Daniel outlasts his conquerors. He outlasts Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar's son, and actually the Babylonians, because King Cyrus is king of Persia. And so we can see here that success without compromise is possible, even in the midst of captivity. So here's a quote that I like. God is calling on us to make a stand of faith in the midst of our constantly changing culture, a prospect that is frightening as well as exciting. So we can see today, as in Daniel's time, God is in control. God is sovereign. God continues to distribute wisdom. The God of modern culture is self. We see it everywhere. We struggle with greed, lust, pride, our own desires. Those make potent and powerful temptations. Daniel tells us that there are multiple ways to be a believer in an unbelieving world. We will see as we go through the book that Daniel not only remained faithful to God, but he exercised significant influence on the godless world around him. Challenges for us, and as we move forward through the book of Daniel, we will see some specific examples of how Daniel and his friends accomplished that.